I invite you now to stand as we read the gospel, the words of Jesus and the apostles. John chapter 20, verses 24 through 29 can be found on page 907 of the Pew Bible if you wish to follow along. John chapter 20, verses 24 through 29. Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Thanks be to God. Please be seated.
Well, good morning again. I had an interesting thing happen when I was in second grade. I was living out in unincorporated Knox County of Knox County, Tennessee. And we lived out, we didn't have very many neighbors. It was winter time. And this nearby pond, there was a pond just down the hill from where we lived, and this winter it froze over. And I did have one neighbor, he lived a ways away, and he was kind of a little bit older boy, and he was a little bit rowdy. And one winter day, I saw him out walking on the pond. It had frozen over, and I thought, that looks like the most amazing thing ever. And so I went down to the pond, and he was out there having a blast on the pond, and I wanted to be out there. I wanted to be having fun with him, and so I took a step out onto the frozen pond, and then I took another step, and then I got really filled with doubt. And I was like, well, these two steps have held me up, but I don't know about that step out there. And I don't know if it's going to be strong enough. And there he was. He was out having fun, but I couldn't deny that I was not sure about that next step. I wasn't sure it would hold me up, and so there were two obvious options. One was I could just leave the ice and not have fun on it. The other is that I could pretend that I didn't have these doubts inside of me and pretend to not be afraid. But then, how do you have fun when you're afraid the whole time? So I didn't want either of those options, and so another idea popped into my second grade brain. And I ran back to my house where my dad in the garage had a couple old golf clubs. And I took one of these golf clubs and I ran back to the pond and I stepped out onto the ice, and then I took that golf club and I slammed it onto the ice in front of me. I mean, I didn't hold anything back. I slammed it a couple times, and I thought, well, I think that part's safe. And so I took another step out, and then I slammed it in front of me again, holding nothing back. And I just made my way out onto the ice, asking the ice, "Are you going to be able to hold me up?" "I think that part's going to hold me up." And so I walked out, and then I had a blast on the ice. It was extraordinary. I had a similar experience my freshman year of college. It was the first time I took a religion course at a secular university. It was a course on ancient Israel. And I was a new believer at the time. I was on the edges of my faith. I was starting to enjoy the faith and life in Jesus. But then being in this class, it raised some new questions for me about the Christian faith that I was standing on. And I wondered, well, what about the Epic of Gilgamesh, this other flood story? And what does that mean about the Old Testament story about the flood? And all of a sudden, I had some of these questions and doubts about the Christian faith that I was standing on. There are two obvious responses when you have doubts about the Christian faith. Number one, you can leave the ice. You can say, "I'm not sure, I have these doubts," and so walk away or try to walk away from the faith. Another obvious option would be to pretend that you don't have the doubts that you have. And pretend that you don't have the questions that you have. And kind of keep walking out on the Christian faith. Yeah, I'm smiling. Did people think I'm smiling? And you can pretend you don't have the questions. Pretend you don't have the doubts. Well, my freshman year of college, as I was in this course and questions were being brought up, I took a note from my second grade self. And I went and got a big old golf club. It was a golf club made up of some of these questions I now had about my faith. And I took that golf club and I slammed it down on the Christian faith. I asked the questions that were coming up to me. I took my doubts and I slammed them down, holding back no mercy to see, is this real? Is this true? Is this firm? And you know what I found out? It held up just fine. That the Christian faith is solid. It is sure. It is real. That God isn't afraid of my questions. That Jesus isn't embarrassed when I have questions or doubts. And that He welcomed me bringing them to Him. And then, because I had slammed, I had more assurance about the Christian faith. And I was able to go out and slide around and play and enjoy my faith in ways that I hadn't before. I think this is why I like Thomas so much. Not just Thomas Hernandez, who's back here, whom I do like a lot. But I'm talking about the Thomas we just read about, that Lynn read about from the Gospel of John in the 20th chapter. Thomas, a.k.a., what do we call him? Doubting Thomas, as in, don't be a. This phrase that never occurs in the Scriptures that we use to indicate don't ask questions. Don't be a doubting Thomas. I think maybe we've misnamed Thomas. I think he would more appropriately be named absent Thomas. The guy's real problem was he wasn't there when Jesus appeared to the other disciples. Right? Verse 24, now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. You see, the other disciples, he was out, we don't know, maybe he was shopping for them. We don't know. But he happened to not be there when Jesus appeared, and Jesus said, peace be to you, and his peace was given to them. And this encounter that the other disciples had with Jesus filled them with peace, filled them with trust. And then Jesus leaves. Thomas comes back and they say, Thomas, guess what? We're filled with peace now. Jesus came back. And Thomas, absent Thomas, let's just try it out, see if it catches. Absent Thomas said, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not filled with that peace that you have. I wasn't here. I didn't have the encounter that you had. And then he says, unless I see the hands, in his hands, the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I'll never believe. You see, what I like about Thomas is he didn't choose one of the first two options. He didn't choose to leave and say, I don't know, you guys are filled with this peace and this faith now, and I don't have it, and so I don't belong anymore. He didn't leave. I also like that Thomas didn't pretend. And that option was there for him, right? He could have said, oh, okay, yeah, I'm smiling. I have the peace too, but he didn't pretend. I like it that Thomas went back to the garage and he picked out a big old golf club. And he wasn't afraid to hammer it against what had happened and say, I don't know. Unless I have this encounter with Jesus, I've got doubts inside of me. Is it because he was doubtful by nature? When we name him Doubting Thomas, that's a little bit kind of how we're concluding, right? That he was born doubtful and that's kind of a mark against him. We don't know that. It could be that he just wasn't there and he wants the encounter for himself. It could be that it was too good to believe. Imagine hearing for the first time that Jesus was resurrected. Not for your 19th time, as you guys have heard it. How old are you guys? 14, 15? 15? 14? Some of you 15. You've heard the resurrection story all these times, right? He's hearing it for the first time, and maybe it's just too good to believe. And like, if that is true, that changes everything. I need to know. I need to prove this. We don't know why. But he had his questions, and he asked them. He wasn't afraid of doing that. 8 days, absent Thomas is hanging out with the peaceful disciples. 8 days. Think about those 8 days. And maybe the temptation to just leave. Like, these people, their peace is getting on me. Or imagine his pressure in those times, in those long 8 days, to give in and say, yeah, I don't doubt anymore. I don't have any questions. See, I'm smiling, right? 8 days, he didn't do any of it. He kept banging with that golf club, with the questions that he had. And Jesus comes back. And I love this part of the story. Jesus appears and he says the same thing again. He says, my peace be to all of you, including Thomas in the room. And I love that Jesus didn't then single Thomas out and say, Thomas, how dare you doubt? Don't be. He didn't say that. Jesus did not say that. Jesus did single Thomas out. And he said to him, in essence, I know your questions. I know your doubts. I know that you weren't here. Thomas, come here. Put your fingers right here. Put them in the holes of my hand. Come here and put your hand. Feel the wound in my side. Jesus wasn't there when Thomas had made this proclamation, unless I touch this, unless I put my hand here. But Jesus knows. And it's like Jesus is saying to him, I know your secret questions. I know your doubts. I'm not afraid of those. Come have an encounter with me. And he does. And he has the encounter. And Jesus says to him, don't distrust, trust. And he does. Seeing Jesus, having his own encounter with Jesus, he's filled with peace. He's filled with faith. He's filled with trust. And it's real. And he proclaims, as we have it in the scripture, my Lord and my God. A proclamation of trust in Jesus. I love this story. I love how Jesus says to him, if you need to bang the ice, bang the ice. Don't leave the ice. Don't pretend you aren't filled with doubts or have doubts. Bang it. It can handle it. The Christian faith is strong. It's sure. It's solid. Jesus says, I'm big enough to handle your questions. I'm not squeamish around your questions. I'm not squeamish about the Epic of Gilgamesh. Bring it on. And I love how Jesus says this. You know, there's one thing in the Gospels that Jesus doesn't like, and this becomes clear if you read any of the Gospels from beginning to end. Jesus does not like silence. It's the one thing he doesn't like is when someone has a question and turns away, curls away from Jesus, refusing to ask their question. Jesus does not like that. Jesus says, bring to me your questions. Bring to me your doubts. Bring to me your hurts. Bring to me all the ways that you have been left out in life. Bring it all to me. The one thing Jesus doesn't like is withholding, pretending, or walking away. Does this mean, is Jesus saying you should ask questions just for the sake of asking questions? Which some people say these days, right? It's all about asking questions. Answers, who needs answers? It's all about asking questions. That is not what Jesus is saying here. After all, he goes on to say this, Thomas, do you trust me because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet believe and yet have trust. Jesus is underscoring, I would argue here, two things about the nature of trust. Number one, that trust is beautiful. Trust is beautiful. Jesus wants people out on the ice having fun. He wants people to be trusting him and living a life of trust with him. It's great to be able to walk in trust. He doesn't want us to be shaky and wandering on the ice. It's beautiful to have trust inside of us. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet trust. Trust is always beautiful. Don't ask questions just for the sake of asking questions. If you have trust and peace inside of you, skate. Enjoy the ice. Live in your faith. Trust is beautiful. But the other nature of trust that Jesus is underscoring here, I think, is that trust cannot be forced. Trust cannot be faked. You either trust or you don't trust. And Jesus says, so don't force it, don't fake it. Thomas, if you need to see me in order to trust, see me, brother. Put your hands here, touch me, have an encounter with me. Jesus knows all of our questions, all of our doubts, and he's not squeamish around them. And he's not going to find out about them and say, why are you a doubting Thomas? Oh my gosh. Jesus knows our questions. He knows our doubts. And the one thing he longs for is that we would bring them to him. Bang the golf club. Don't have mercy with it. Because what lies on the other side of asking our questions, because the Christian faith is solid and sure and real and true, what lies on the other side of asking our doubts is assurance and freedom to skate. Researchers tell us this about the Christian faith, as the Reverend Dr. Jason Broggie wrote in an article recently called "The Role of Doubt in Faith Formation." We tend to think that doubt is the opposite of faith. It's not the case. Actually, doubt has a role in faith formation. I'm quoting here, "As Christians, we have this innate desire to protect kids from religious doubts in the hope that this will keep them within the walls of the kingdom. Yet research suggests that doubt is an important part of the process of forming a healthy religious identity. It is a key process to confirm and take ownership of identity." To confirm, an interesting verb, isn't it? That asking our questions is an important part of confirming our faith. What if you're somewhere in between? That happens, right? And maybe you're sitting there saying, well, I don't know that I'm like absent Thomas, and that I have these bold proclamations I will never believe unless this happens. And sometimes I skate and I have faith, and other times, but then I'm out on the ice, and then other times I wonder and I have some questions. What do I do with that? I love the model that we have in Mark 9. There's a father, a desperate father whose son is having seizures. And he asked Jesus this question, and it is a question that is as profound in its insight as it is in its vulnerability. He says, "Jesus, if you can do something for my son, would you?" And Jesus says to him, If I can do something? Do you doubt that I can do something?" And Jesus, he narrows right in on the doubt. "Bring the doubt to me, brother. Bring it to me." And I love how the Father then responds. This is Mark 9:24. This should be on more bookmarks, I believe. "I believe, semicolon, help my unbelief, exclamation mark." Isn't that extraordinary? That's the Father's prayer. I believe, help my unbelief. I'm a mixture of the two. And I do believe, and I skate, and I have faith, and sometimes I don't. And help me in those times, Jesus. Brothers and sisters, I believe that Jesus' interaction with absent Thomas gives us good reason to believe that Jesus likes that kind of prayer, that he answers that kind of prayer. I believe, help my unbelief. And that we should bring our questions to him and take our doubts and bang them against the faith. God is not afraid of our questions. He's not afraid of our doubt. He just wants us to bring them to him. And brothers and sisters, it's solid. It's true. In second grade, I went inside after having a blast. I had a great time. And I went inside and I told my mom, I said, "Mom, guess what we did?" And I was telling her how we, went out, but I had a golf club, and I was banging, and every step I took, before I took the step, I would bang it with the golf club, and then I'd walk out on it, and da-da-da. And my mom was surprisingly okay with it at first. And I'm describing it, and then there came a moment in our conversation where she said, wait, where were you? And I found out she thought I was talking about a little puddle that was in our driveway that had also frozen over. And she said, wait, you were on the pond? I got in trouble. I got in a lot of trouble. It's different with Jesus and the Christian faith. Bring your doubts. Bring your questions. You don't get in trouble. What you get is a Jesus who says, I see it. Put your hand here. put your hand here. Bring it to me. And what's on the other side of that is trust and assurance and faith. Maybe not always perfect robin egg blue pastel faith. Maybe sometimes it's messy, one-day-old robin hatched faith. But it is a beautiful thing. It is life nonetheless. The good news, brothers and sisters, is that God nurtures trust within us in all sorts of ways. That's what I love about the hymn 523, is that it celebrates what it is like to trust and obey. That is this beautiful state that God wants for all of us. And so no matter where you are this morning, brothers and sisters, if you are asking questions or you have belief, let us bring this hymn to God in prayer. Would you turn to hymn number 523, stand with me, and let us celebrate the beauty of trust.